people think I am out to just criticize church structures. So I thought I would ask myself a question. What would it have looked like to try to build a religion around Jesus in real time? Not just to follow him, not just to believe in him, to actually take what he was doing and make it survive him. Because Jesus was not building a denomination. And he didn't leave a handbook. He was not laying out a packaged system for every generation that came later. He was dealing with people. Directly. Precisely. In real time. And that matters. Because a living teacher can speak one way to one person and another way to somebody else, and both responses can be perfectly true. He can confront pride in one moment and steady fear in the next. He can press, he can expose, he can also comfort or warn. Not because truth changed, but because the person in front of him changed. That kind of teaching works when the teacher is in the room. But once he is gone, there is a problem, a question. The question is no longer just what he meant. Now the question is, how do you carry this forward? How do you preserve it? How do you teach it to people who were never there? How do you hold communities together across geography, language, conflict, culture, memory, power, and time? That can get complicated quickly. And I think if we miss that, we oversimplify what happened to Christianity. Because yes, a lot drifted. A lot hardened. A lot became more managerial than alive. But some of what formed was also an attempt to solve an actual historical problem. The stories had to be told. Teachings had to be remembered. The witness had to be organized. Arguments had to be answered. And the communities had to be held together somehow. So living memory becomes tradition. Tradition becomes structure. Structure becomes institution. You can see why that happened. A small group around a living teacher can operate one way. A civilization-scale religion cannot. Once you scale, you need shared language. You need repeatable forms. You need boundaries. You need guidance. You need continuity. And that is where the shift begins. Jesus dealt with persons. The institution had to deal with populations. A conversation can be precise. A doctrine has to travel. A living encounter can be tailored. An institution has to generalize. That does not make the institution innocent. But it does make the problem more understandable. Because the more you scale, the more you simplify. And the more you simplify, the more you risk flattening something that was alive when it was first spoken. That is where a lot of Christianity started losing the center. Not always through bad intent. Not always through some cartoon version of corruption. Sometimes through the simple logic of scale. Because systems reward what can be standardized. Clear categories, stable formulas, recognizable authority, manageable belief, repeatable language. But Jesus was not mainly producing standardization. He was producing encounter, action, movement, reorientation. And those things do not scale cleanly. That is why this matters to me beyond just criticizing the church. Because this same problem shows up anywhere you try to build around orientation. If what matters most is the actual inward posture of the person, then you cannot solve that with structure alone. You can point toward it. You can build language around it. You can build practices around it. But you cannot mass-produce living alignment the way you mass-produce a rulebook. And that is exactly why Neo-Eclectic Christianity takes the approach it does. Neo-Eclectic Christianity is not trying to pretend history does not matter. It is not pretending structure has no place. It is not claiming everyone after the first century got everything wrong. It's doing something more specific than that. It's trying to protect the center. Because once you see the problem, you also see the risk. The system built around Christ can slowly start speaking louder than Christ. That is why Neo-Eclectic Christianity does not read the Bible flat. It treats Scripture as a three-tiered vessel. The direct words of Jesus first. The witness around him second. The wider biblical record third. not to throw the rest away, not to disrespect the tradition, but to keep the center from being buried under the structure built around it. Because if Jesus Christ is the key, then everything else has to be read through him. Not beside him, not over him, through him. That is the whole point. Once all speech is treated as identical, all context is treated as equal, once all audience is treated as the same, and every verse is flattened into the same category, the living precision of Christ disappears into a religious pile of material. And then something strange happens. You can keep the language of Jesus while drifting from the pattern of Jesus. You can quote him while no longer moving the way he moved. You can build systems in his name that no longer resemble the way he dealt with actual people. So Neo-Eclectic Christianity, as I see it, is an attempt to move back upstream, not backward in some naive sense, not pretending 2,000 years can be erased. Upstream interpretively, back closer to the source, back closer to Christ as the orienting center, back closer to letting his words govern the reading of everything else, instead of letting everything else crowd in around him until the center gets obscured. Because if the core problem is that relational truth becomes hardened into generalized religious machinery, then the answer is not just to build another hard shell and act like we solved it. The answer has to begin lower, person by person, node by node, orientation by orientation. That is where I think real coherence starts. Not from the top down first, from the bottom up first. If enough people are actually aligned around the right center, then patterns begin to form between them. Language forms, trust forms, expectations form, communities form, a shared gravity begins to emerge. That kind of order is not fake. It is not chaos. It's not everybody doing whatever they want. It is coherence that grows out of living alignment instead of being imposed as a substitute for it. And that, to me, is the better model. Not no structure, but structure downstream of orientation. Structure as the result of life, not the replacement for it. Because once the container becomes primary, the container starts defending itself. Then preserving the institution becomes more important than preserving the center that gave rise to it. And that is when religion gets dangerous. Not just because it makes mistakes, but because it can slowly teach people to confuse loyalty to the structure with faithfulness to Christ. That is a serious difference. So yes, I think modern Christianity is off course in many places, but I do not think the whole story is simple malice. Part of it is the burden of scale. Part of it is the difficulty of preserving something living in historical form. Part of it is what happens when direct encounter has to become transmissible tradition. Still, explanation is not the same thing as justification. At some point, you still have to ask the question, are these structures actually helping people orient toward Christ? Or are they mostly teaching people how to remain legible inside inherited systems? That is the test, not whether the institution is old, not whether the doctrine is polished, not whether the structure is large, whether the center is alive in the people. Because if the center is alive in the nodes, coherence can still emerge. If it is not, no amount of organizational strength can save the thing. And maybe that is the harder truth. The future of anything Christ-centered may not depend first on building stronger containers. It may depend on whether enough people become rightly oriented, deeply enough, that something healthy can grow between them. So today's question, are we actually pointed toward Jesus? Or are we just pointed where we have been directed?